Morning everyone, in this video we're going to look at some of the key quotations for Lady Macbeth. I'll put any necessary links down below and there's an exam style question at the end for you to have a go at. Right, let's get started. For this video we're working under the assumption that you've been asked to explore how Shakespeare presents the character of Lady Macbeth. We'll look at 6 different ways this question could be approached and the key quotations that support these approaches. Keep in mind that there are hundreds of ways that this question could be answered, and all of these quotations could be interpreted in multiple ways. This video is just to give you the basics though. Now I've listed Lady Macbeth's key scenes in the purple box. It might be useful to make a note of these scenes as they are all rich with Lady Macbeth quotations. First off, we'll start with Lady Macbeth's ambition. Now the first time that we meet her in Act 1 Scene 5, she's reading a letter that Macbeth sent to her. Immediately after reading it, we can see that she is already starting to formulate a plan. She says that Macbeth is the Thane of Glamis and Cawdor and he will become king like the witches planned. This would, of course, make her the queen and we see how ambitious she is. She goes on to say that Macbeth needs to get home quick so that she can convince him and persuade him what he needs to do in order to get to the throne. And a bit later on, in Act 1 Scene 7, we see that she is so blindly ambitious and so determined that she tells Macbeth there's no way that they could fail. Next, let's think of Lady Macbeth as a controlling influence in the play. She's quite manipulative, and particularly towards Macbeth. Remember, she persuades him to murder the king in his sleep. Now we'll start with Act 1 Scene 5 where Lady Macbeth is speaking about her husband and notes that she fears he's too nice to go through with the plan that she desires. And this sets about her course of manipulation where she goes out of her way to convince him to kill Duncan. In these two quotes, "Come you spirits" and "Come thick night," both from the same monologue in the same scene, she speaks to the spirits and to nature. But if you focus on the imperative verbs, it seems as though she's given orders to the spirits with "Come you spirits," "Unsex me here," "Make thick my blood," and so on. So it seems as though she's in charge of these supernatural forces too. Or maybe she's just arrogant enough to think that she's the one in control. And at the end of the scene, she tells her husband to leave it all to her. Now moving forward to Scene 7, she starts to manipulate Macbeth with a few different quotations accusing him of being a coward if he bails on their plan. And then, the final nail in the coffin, she insults his masculinity to convince him, and this seems to work. After the murder, she controls him further, essentially by shaming him into getting a grip on himself. She says that she has blood on her hands too, both literally and metaphorically, but at least she's not a coward like him, and then commands him to go and wash away his guilt. And in Act 3 Scene 4, Macbeth isn't having the best time after seeing his friend's ghost sit at the dinner table. Again, his wife tries to calm him and control him with insults, saying he's acting like a woman telling scary stories to her grandma. Next, we'll look at Lady Macbeth as being atypical. Keep in mind that Macbeth was written in the 17th century and is set in the 11th century. It would be quite useful for you to research what society expected of a stereotypical woman in these eras of history. You'll then get an understanding of how atypical Lady Macbeth is when compared to these stereotypes. So the first time that we meet Lady Macbeth is in Act 1 Scene 5 and she talks about her battlements. Now the fact that she refers to the castle as belonging to her is not typical of a woman of that time period who traditionally didn't own any property. Next we have the famous "Unsex me here" speech where she commands the spirits to make her less feminine and caring, giving her the cruelty that she needs to see her plan through. A little later, in Scene 7, she starts questioning Macbeth in an accusatory tone, something that is unusual given that in those times obedience to the husband was expected. Now if you consider stereotypical feminine traits to be loving, caring, motherly, nurturing, It seems shocking that Lady Macbeth says that she would have smashed her baby's head against the wall if she had given her word that she would. That's how committed she is to becoming queen. And speaking of feminine traits, Macbeth states that Lady M is so ruthless she probably couldn't even give birth to a girl. She's composed of so many typically masculine traits that she could only possibly give birth to a male. One other obvious feature that not a lot of students pick up on is that she doesn't actually have her own name. It's quite a subtle way for Shakespeare to show the expected status of Lady Macbeth, not even important enough to have her own name, which makes it all the more interesting that she's such a dominating character. One observation that people make about Lady Macbeth is that she is presented as being ruthless. In fact, even though she doesn't kill anyone herself, she comes across as considerably more ruthless than Macbeth. I've got 8 quotes for a ruthless Lady Macbeth, so let's go through them. First is "take my milk for gall." You can interpret this quote in loads of different ways, but essentially she's asking the spirits to rid her of womanhood, making her ruthless enough to carry out her plans. Then she notes that Duncan won't ever see the light of day again. Again, the quote about dashing the baby's brains out is good for showing how ruthless and heartless she really is. And I think it's quite ruthless of her to drug the guards and frame them for Duncan's murder. Admittedly, they weren't doing their jobs very well anyway, but they didn't deserve to die for it. After Duncan's murder, the Macbeths meet in Act 2, Scene 2, and Macbeth is feeling guilty. He's freaking out about what he's just done, and Lady Macbeth tells him that his thoughts are foolish. Their crimes clearly haven't affected her very much, or at least not as much as Macbeth. Not yet, anyway. When she finds out that Macbeth still has the daggers instead of planting them on the guards as per the plan, she calls him infirm of purpose, which basically means useless. And then she goes and does it herself anyway. And she thinks so little about killing a man that trusted them implicitly that she thinks a little water will clear them, as if she can just wash away the guilt. Note that her stance on this issue changes drastically by the time Act 5 rolls around. And the final quote I picked out for Lady Macbeth as ruthless is, "What's done is done." This is quite a dismissive statement to make about murder. She's basically saying, what are you gonna do? Another way that we could say that Lady Macbeth is presented is as deceitful. She's quite two-faced, saying one thing whilst believing something completely different. Take the quote, "look like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it." Here she's telling Macbeth to look Duncan in the eye and welcome him, while secretly plotting his demise. In Act 1, Scene 7, she says that once they've killed Duncan, they'll let it be known that they're really upset about the murder, even though it was them that just killed him. And she does exactly that. She seems quite shocked that the murder happened in their house, deceiving everyone there. And then there's a stage direction which seems to suggest that she faints, or at least pretends to try and throw everyone off the scent. And in Act 3, Scene 4, she again speaks to Macbeth about how he needs to disguise his true feelings in front of the guests, which links back to her innocent flower quote from earlier. And then, during the banquet with Banquo, Lady Macbeth tries to deceive all of the guests by claiming that Macbeth has had fits since he was a child, which he hasn't. The final interpretation of Lady Macbeth that we'll look at in this video goes a different way to all the others. For this slide, we're going to look at how she might be interpreted as weak. In Act 2, Scene 2, she reveals that she couldn't kill Duncan herself by saying Duncan resembles her own father too much. So we get this picture of an innocent and childlike Lady Macbeth talking about her dad. So here, maybe, like a child, she isn't violent enough to do the task herself. Now throughout the play, Lady Macbeth changes a great deal. In the first 2 acts, she's clearly the dominant one in the marriage. In Act 3, this starts to change, and she isn't actually in Act 4. But by Act 5, her feelings of guilt have consumed her completely, and she's descended into madness. Act 5 starts where the Doctor observes her sleepwalking, which is an act that he describes as a great disturbance in nature. Sleepwalking was seen as a sign of madness, and madness was seen as a weakness. The gentlewoman says that Lady Macbeth has a light with her continually, just like in this picture, indicating that she's scared of the dark. She's descended from this great and powerful woman to being just like a little child. Then she hallucinates, seeing blood on her hands. She repeats words such as out, and she repeats the actions of washing her hands, repetition here linking to madness. And the same applies to this quotation, with the hallucination being experienced through more than one sense, showing that the madness is overtaken her. And again with the repetition of oh. Then finally we find out that she has died. It's implied that she took her own life, and this act, particularly in those times, was seen as a weakness. They believed that suicide victims wouldn't even get into heaven because of the sin. Now, I'd fully recommend making your own set of revision cards for Lady Macbeth and her key quotations. You can add any of the quotes from this video, as well as a few of your own that you've found. A lot of students often forget that making the revision cards yourself is revision in itself. And as they're all in your own words, they're much more beneficial than buying a set of pre-made revision cards. Just remember that you need to use the revision cards properly and regularly for them to have effect. Repetition is the key to memorization. And here we've got an exam style question for you to complete. You have an extract from Act 5 Scene 1, the sleepwalking scene, and the question is nice and vague. Starting with this extract, explain how far you think Shakespeare presents Lady Macbeth. Write about how Shakespeare presents Lady Macbeth in this extract, and then write about how Shakespeare presents Lady Macbeth in the play as a whole. Stick to the structure that your teacher has told you. I would stick to the structure that your teacher has told you, but in a 45-minute response, I would tell my students to write a minimum of 2 paragraphs, maximum of 3. I'd go for 1 paragraph on bullet point 1, the extract, 1 paragraph on bullet point 2, which is the entire play. You could use any quotes from this video for that. And then, if you have time, a 3rd paragraph on a bullet point of your choice. Remember to time yourself so that you're used to the timings of the exam, plus extra time if you get it. So if you're giving this question a go, pause the video now and get started. And that's all for today's video. If you found it useful, don't be shy with the like and subscribe buttons. And if there are any topics that you want me to make a video on, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy revising.